All right, so we turn at last to Aquinas' fifth way of arguing for God's existence, and as I noted in our first video, this argument is often referred to as the argument from finality to the existence of a divine supreme intellect. It's also sometimes called a variety or a version of what's known as the teleological argument. Now let me explain those labels to start us out here. First, finality has to do with what we've referred to in earlier videos as final cause, which is one of Aristotle's four causes. So the idea is that the objects in the world around us exhibit finality or final causality insofar as they all of their nature aim or point toward certain typical manifestations or outcomes or end states as their natural effects. Think of the way that an acorn, for example, when you plant it, aims or points toward becoming an oak tree. You plant an acorn, as long as the acorn's not damaged in some way, it's going to grow into a tree. It's not going to grow into a cat. It's not going to grow into a Volkswagen. It's only ever going to grow into a tree. That's what the acorn aims or points toward. Of course, it might not do so if it's in some way frustrated, when you damage it, say, by stomping on it, or if a squirrel eats it or something. But the point is that if it's not damaged, and it's put in the right triggering circumstances, like being planted and watered, it's going to grow into a tree reliably. That's the outcome we can expect given the nature of the acorn. Or to use another example I've used earlier, if you strike a match, given the chemistry of the sulfur in the head of the match, it's going to generate flame and heat. It's not going to turn into a bouquet of roses. It's not going to turn into a bird. It's going to generate flame and heat, at least if it's in good working order and has not been damaged. Here too, if you interfere with it in some way, say by submerging the match in water, then you'll prevent it from generating flame and heat, but that's because you've damaged it. But if it's in good working order and you strike the match under ordinary conditions, it's going to generate flame and heat. That's what the sulfur in the match naturally aims or points toward. And the objects that make up the world around us are in general like that. They all exhibit final causality in that they typically aim or point towards certain characteristic effects or ranges of effect. So the argument is called the argument from finality because it begins with that feature of the world, that things exhibit final causality. Now, final causality is also sometimes called teleology. That's from the Greek word telos, T-E-L-O-S, which means end or goal, as in the end goal or purpose that a thing might have. And so it's called a teleological argument because naturally it starts from the reality of final causes or purposes, ends or goals, whatever you want to call them. And again, the strategy is to show that you couldn't have this kind of goal seeking, you couldn't have this kind of purpose in the natural world unless there were some divine mind that was aiming things toward these goals or purposes, say. Okay, so that's the general idea of the argument and the reason for this terminology, the reason for these labels of the argument. And as I noted in an earlier video, at least the second, third, fourth, and fifth of Aquinas' arguments can be seen as having as their takeoff points one or the other of Aristotle's four causes. This is, not something maybe every commentator on Aquinas would say, but I think there's some plausibility to it. I noted that second way begins with the idea of efficient cause. The third way I suggested begins with the idea of material cause. And the fourth way with the idea of formal cause. That leaves final cause among Aristotle's four causes, and that's the one that's definitely operating here in the fifth way. Okay, so how does the argument work? Well, in the first stage of the argument, Aquinas argues for the reality of final causality or teleology. What he says is that, and here I'm going to read the text of the argument, or this particular line of the text of the argument. He says, we see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, that is to say, physical objects that make up the natural world, act for an end, and this is evident from their acting always or nearly always in the same way so as to attain the best result, unquote. Okay, now what he means by that is this, that we find in the world around us regular patterns of cause and effect, regular patterns of what we called in earlier videos efficient cause. Again, you strike the match, you generate flame and heat. The match is a reliable, efficient cause of flame and heat. You plant the acorn, you get a tree growing out as a result. the act of planting the acorn is the efficient cause of bringing about the tree. And so on for other things. If I wrap my knuckles on the desk, you're going to hear a knock, right? And we see in thousands of ways in the world around us every day patterns of cause and effect, where these cause and effect patterns are reliable. We can depend on them. The world operates in the same way over and over again, day in and day out. And what Aquinas is saying here in the argument is that we couldn't make sense of how this is so, of why this is so. We couldn't make sense of the reliability of efficient causes unless we thought also in terms of final causes. That is to say, when we note that when you strike a match, the sulfur in the head of the match is going to generate flame and heat. And again, that's a reliable, predictable pattern. You know that's what's going to happen when you strike a match, as long as the match is not damaged. We couldn't make sense of the fact that the match is a reliable, efficient cause of flame and heat specifically, as opposed to turning into a bouquet of roses, or as opposed to generating an ice cube or no effect at all, unless we supposed that generating flame and heat is the final cause or end or goal or purpose that the sulfur in the match points to. We couldn't make sense of the fact that when you plant an acorn, you always get a tree out as a result, as opposed to a cat or a Volkswagen, unless we supposed that generating a tree is the end or goal or purpose that the acorn points to. And so on for other cause and effect patterns in the world, patterns of efficient cause. Wherever we have a reliable connection between a certain kind of cause A and a certain kind of effect B, that is to say, whenever we find that A is a reliable, efficient cause of B, that can only be because generating B is the final cause of A, the final cause or goal or end state that A points to as its characteristic effect. So that efficient causality in Aquinas' view, cannot be made sense of apart from final cause. Final causality is, in this way, for Aquinas, the glue that holds the universe together, as it were, that makes it possible for the world of physical objects to have these regular, reliable cause and effect relations between them. In fact, Aquinas famously says that the final cause is the cause of causes. It's the most important of Aristotle's four causes. Think of it this way. Take another example, a hammer, say, which is a kind of, that's not a natural object, that's a man-made object, but it'll serve to make the point here. The hammer has the final cause or purpose of pounding nails, say. That's its end, that's its goal. But it can do that only if it has a certain measure of solidity, right? You can have a hammer made out of butter that's something that's in the shape of a hammer, but it's not a true hammer. It's just, something that looks like one because it doesn't have the solidity of a hammer. You can't pound nails with a hammer made out of butter. So in order to function as a hammer, an object has to have a certain structure. You might say a certain formal cause. It's got to be a kind of oblong, solid, durable, hard object. Otherwise, it couldn't function as a hammer. So to fulfill the final cause of functioning as a hammer, the object has to have a certain formal cause or structure. But only certain kinds of matter are able to take on that form or structure. Again, butter cannot take on the form of a hammer, where the form doesn't just mean the shape, it means all the defining attributes, including the durability and solidity. So the final cause of functioning as a hammer also underlies the material cause, the fact that a hammer has to be made out of something really durable, like steel, say. And then finally, only certain kinds of process can bring a hammer into being. They don't grow on trees. Somebody's got to manufacture them. And so that brings us to the efficient cause. The final cause of functioning as a hammer determines that only certain kinds of efficient causal process can bring the hammer into existence. So in these ways, for Aquinas, the final cause is what he calls the cause of causes. It's the most important of the four causes because it underlies all the others. And all that's lurking in the background here of the fifth way as well. So the first stage of the argument wants to say, look, we couldn't make sense of there being regular patterns of cause and effect in the world at all, of A reliably bringing about B, whatever A and B are, unless we thought of A as aiming toward B as its final cause or purpose. Final cause is what makes all cause and effect intelligible or understandable. Okay, that's the first stage of the argument. But the second stage notes that things that don't have intelligence, and note that most of the things that we're talking about here do not have intelligence. An acorn doesn't think, gee, I want to be an oak tree when I grow up or something, right? The sulfur in the head of the match isn't thinking, boy, I really want to generate flame and heat. I hope somebody strikes the match. It's not thinking anything. These things are totally unconscious, totally unintelligent. And that's important to keep in mind here, that when Aquinas, following Aristotle, talks about the ends or purposes that things serve, he doesn't mean that they do this consciously. Most things don't. Of course, a human being can have conscious ends and purposes. A non-human animal, though it lacks intelligence, nevertheless can at least be aware of certain goals that it has, like seeking out food or water. But most things are not like that. Plants and non-living things, they aim or point towards certain ends or goals, but without being in any way aware, much less intellectually grasping or understanding the ends or goals that they point to. So Aquinas notes that non-intelligent things, like inanimate objects, like the sulfur in my example of the match and so forth, or an unintelligent thing like an acorn, my other example, he argues that unintelligent things can aim or point towards some end or goal only if directed by something that does have intelligence. In the way that, he used the analogy, the way that an arrow will reach its target only insofar as it's pointed toward it by the archer, who has that target in mind, has that goal in mind of getting that arrow dead center in the target. It's going to happen only insofar as the archer, who has intelligence, aims the arrow in that direction. And in the same way, Aquinas wants to argue, no non-intelligent thing could aim or point towards some end or goal, like the way the acorn points toward becoming an oak tree, or the sulfur in the match points toward generating flame and heat, unless there were some intelligence aiming or directing those things toward their goals. Now, why does he think that? The reason, I would say, is that Aquinas is relying on the premise that a cause can have efficacy, that is to say, it can have effects, it can bring things about, only if it in some sense exists. And that's as true of final cause as it is of efficient cause. Obviously, a non-existent efficient cause can't generate anything, right? You can't strike a non-existent match and generate flame or heat. Okay. That's obvious enough when we're talking about efficient causes, what brings something into being. But it's also true of final causes, the ends or goals that things aim toward. So the acorn points toward the end state or goal of becoming an oak. It points towards something having that form or pattern of being a tree. Okay, and an acorn is not a tree. At least it's not a fully grown tree. It aims toward becoming a fully grown tree, something with a trunk and bark and branches and leaves, but none of that exists yet while the acorn has just been planted in the ground. Or the sulfur in the match aims or it points toward the end state of generating flame and heat, towards something having that form or pattern of flame or heat. But until you've struck the match, that pattern of flame and heat doesn't yet exist. The sulfur points to it, but it doesn't yet exist. The acorn points toward the pattern of being a tree, but the pattern of being a tree doesn't yet exist until the acorn grows into it. Okay, so the pattern of being a tree, or the form or pattern of being flame and heat, those things are the final causes of the acorn and the sulfur in the head of the match, but they don't yet exist, right? By hypothesis, until you plant that acorn and grow it, the oak tree isn't there. Until you strike that match, the flame isn't there. Now, this generates a puzzle, Aquinas says. If the end state or goal doesn't yet exist, the oak tree doesn't yet exist, the flame and heat don't yet exist, how can they function as causes? How can they explain the way that the acorn and the sulfur in the match operate if they don't yet exist? They have to have some kind of existence. But they don't exist yet until you've struck that match or planted that acorn. They don't exist yet in the physical world around us. The form or pattern of being an acorn, the form or the pattern of being flame or heat don't yet exist in the physical world around us until the match is struck and the acorn is planted. But since they must exist in some way in order to function even as final causes, and yet they don't exist in the material world, the only other way for them to exist is in a mind of some sort, in an intellect. Just like, again, the goal of reaching the target exists in the archer's mind before the arrow is fired. Or to shift examples here, the pattern of being a house exists in the architect's mind before he goes ahead and has the house constructed. Or the image that's on a canvas, say the Mona Lisa, exists in the artist's mind before the painting is actually carried out. In the same way, Aquinas wants to say the end states or goals, the forms or patterns that things aim toward, insofar as they aim toward final causes, must exist in some way, but they don't yet exist in the physical world, again, until you plant the acorn or strike the match. So they must exist in some mind outside the physical world. And this is how he gets to the idea that final causes presuppose a divine mind, a divine intellect. Okay. And it has to be a divine mind because we're talking about the final causes that everything in the physical or material world exhibits. These things aim towards certain outcomes that haven't yet come about in the actual physical world. And yet these end states or goals that haven't yet come about, they function as causes, final causes, not efficient causes, but still as a kind of cause. And so they must have some kind of reality or existence. The only kind of reality or existence they can have is in some kind of mind. And since we're explaining the final causes that exist in the material world, it must be a mind that's beyond the material world. It must be a divine mind. Now, how we work the details of this out, this brings us into further issues that go beyond the fifth way. You'll remember that I've said that what Aquinas is doing in each of the five ways is setting out a kind of sketch or overview of certain arguments rather than answering every objection that someone might raise, and where he's presupposing certain ideas that he's developed elsewhere, and he just applies them in the case of the five ways. So naturally, the unwary reader who isn't familiar with all this background might think to raise certain objections to the fifth way, which indeed he answers elsewhere, but you won't find them in the fifth way itself. But that's the general strategy of the argument. Now, let me note some objections that are often raised to this argument and explain how Aquinas would respond to them. First, we can note a way in which this argument is often misunderstood, just like I noted that the first and second ways are often misunderstood, insofar as critics often think, well, in those arguments, isn't Aquinas basically just saying everything has a cause, the universe must have a cause, and then you can ask what caused God? And I explained how that's not what Aquinas is saying. In fact, he not only doesn't say that everything has a cause, he would reject the idea that everything has a cause. That had to do primarily with the first and second ways. In the case of the fifth way, there's another argument that Aquinas is often confused with, and that's a famous argument associated with the early modern philosophy William Paley, often known as the watchmaker argument, where Paley argues that at least certain objects within the physical world, he takes animals and living things and their organs as his exhibit A, manifest a kind of complexity that Paley thinks is very unlikely to have come about by chance. And so he postulates that it's at least probable that there's some kind of divine designer, something like a cosmic inventor that's responsible for the existence of these complex objects, living things, and so forth. Okay, so it's often thought, well, isn't Aquinas really just giving a version of that sort of argument? And then in that case, wouldn't the argument be subject to exactly the sorts of criticisms that Paley's argument has been subjected to? In particular, the standard critique of Paley is to say, well, Paley's assuming that a complex physical object like an organism, a living thing, or some organ that a living thing has, like the eye or a heart or the lungs or what have you, could only have been come about by design, from intelligent design, because he was not able to imagine any sort of impersonal physical mechanism by which these things could have come about. But now, in starting in the 19th century and then well into the 20th century, we have this alternative account of how living things and their organs can come about, namely Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, and that seems to knock Paley's argument in the head. And so wouldn't this also torpedo Aquinas' argument? Okay, that's a line of objection that people sometimes raise against the fifth way. And I mentioned in our previous video how Richard Dawkins criticizes the fourth way. He also criticizes the fifth way, and he raises precisely this objection against it. Okay. Well, the problem, once again, is that this is based on a misunderstanding of Aquinas's argument. Aquinas is not, in fact, arguing along the sorts of lines that Paley is using. You'll notice if you look at the actual text of the Fifth Way, Aquinas never mentions anything about living things as being sort of examples of physical objects that require some sort of divine intelligence in order to design them. And the reason for that is that it's not complexity as such. It's not things like the intricate way that the eyeball is designed or the intricate way that the nervous system is designed or what have you that strikes Aquinas as being in need of explanation of the Fifth Way. It's any natural pattern of cause and effect whatsoever, even the simplest patterns of cause and effect. So, for example, I said, if we're just talking about the way you strike a match, you're going to get flame and heat as a result. I did use the example of planting an acorn and getting an oak tree. That's an example of a living thing, though that's my example, not Aquinas's. But I indicated other examples as well. The way that if I wrap my knuckles on the table, I'm going to hear a sound as a result. Or you throw a stone through a window, the window is going to shatter and so forth. Those are other reliable examples of cause and effect. And notice that we're not talking about anything terribly complex. A stone is a very simple object, but it will reliably shatter glass if the stone's large enough and the glass is brittle enough. It will reliably shatter glass if you throw the stone at it. The sulfur in the head of a match is not nearly as complex as, say, the human eye is or the human nervous system is. Nevertheless, it reliably generates flame and heat. And what Aquinas is interested in the Fifth Way is not natural objects like living things that are especially complex. And then you got to ask, could these things have arisen through chance and so forth? It's the fact that there's any reliable pattern of cause and effect at all, even the simplest. So it's a very different sort of argument from Paley's. Paley, in his famous design argument, is willing to allow, at least for the sake of argument, that very simple physical systems and very simple physical patterns of cause and effect don't require any sort of intelligence, don't require any sort of designer. So if there weren't living things in the world, if there weren't creatures with eyeballs and hearts and lungs and all these complex biological systems, and you only had, say, stones traveling through space, Paley's argument, it seems, would allow that there was no special reason to think that those things were caused by God, were caused by a supreme intellect. Aquinas' argument is very different. Aquinas thinks that any pattern of regular cause and effect, no matter how simple, even just the way that a stone will, orbiting a star in space, an asteroid, reliably goes around the star in a regular pattern, in a predictable way. That involves a kind of final causality or aiming toward a kind of end state or goal, the way that given the gravitational pull of the star against the asteroid, it will reliably move in this particular orbit, given the right background conditions. That's an example of final causality, of something aiming toward a certain end state or goal. And that's enough for Aquinas to get the Fifth Way off the ground. So biological complexity has nothing to do with it. It's simply a red herring in Aquinas' view. If he had been familiar with Paley's argument, he would say, we don't even need to go there. Now, for that reason, Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is also completely irrelevant to evaluating Aquinas' Fifth Way, and indeed to evaluating any of Aquinas' 5 ways, for that matter. Now, what Aquinas would have thought of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is something people debate. Would he reject it? Would he accept it? I think he could accept at least a big part of it, but whether that's true or not, again, is totally irrelevant to evaluating the Fifth Way, precisely because, again, the Fifth Way is not concerned with biological phenomena in particular, or even with complex physical phenomena, but even the simplest physical phenomena. Therefore, suppose, if Aquinas were around today and familiar with what Darwin had to say, and Darwin would say, well, we can account for the origin of living things and their distinctive organs in terms of processes like mutation and natural selection. And so we don't need to appeal to divine design to account for those. Aquinas would say, okay, well, for the sake of argument, let's suppose that's true. doesn't really matter for the fifth way, because mutation is a causal process. We know, for example, given our knowledge of genetics, that given the way genetic structures reproduce themselves, there's going to be a certain error rate. There are going to be certain flaws as replication occurs, and that will result in what are called mutations. And we understand the causal process by which that happens. So that's a case of reliable patterns of cause and effect. Natural selection itself, the way that if a mutation gives rise to a trait that's harmful, it's going to tend to get weeded out of the population. But if it gives rise to a trait that's beneficial, then it will tend to get hardwired into the population. And soon what started out as just a random mutation that only a few particular organisms had soon permeates the whole population because it's conducive to survival. Okay, well, great, Aquinas would say, that's also a regular or reliable causal process by which a certain kind of cause aims or points toward a certain kind of effect or outcome. And those causal processes, because they are reliable in just the ways they are, exhibit a kind of purpose or teleology aiming toward an end state or goal, even though they're very simple and elementary. And that requires explanation in terms of some intellect that aims these processes towards their ends or goals. So Aquinas could concede everything Darwin and his successors have said. It wouldn't affect the fifth way at all. Indeed, as I say, even a world that had no living things in it at all, so that the question of natural selection was totally irrelevant. If the universe contained nothing but elementary particles exhibiting certain very simple causal powers to attract or repel other particles, say. That's all that existed. There was nothing more complex than that. That will be enough, in Aquinas' view, to serve as a foundation for the reasoning of the fifth way, because even the most simple particle, insofar as it has a tendency to generate certain effects, say to attract or repel some other particle, that involves a kind of final causality or teleology. The particle aims toward this certain outcome. That's enough for the purposes of the fifth way. Okay, so I would say that objections that compare Aquinas' fifth way to William Paley's design argument, and objections that therefore propose that Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection somehow sink the fifth way in just the way that they're supposed to sink Paley's argument. Now, whether they really undermine Paley's argument, I'm going to put that to one side. It's not really relevant. But it certainly doesn't affect Aquinas' argument. That I would say is the main sort of objection leveled against the fifth way. I don't mean to say that there aren't other objections or other issues that arise. There are, and they get a bit more complex. But I would say that's the main sort of objection leveled against Aquinas' fifth way, and it's based on a misunderstanding of the argument. It's based on a false assimilation of the argument to William Paley's design argument. For the same reason, the kinds of issues that arise that have arisen in recent debate over intelligent design, as it's been spelled out by writers like William Dembski and Stephen Meyer and others, whatever one thinks of those arguments, they are also just totally irrelevant to what's going on in Aquinas' fifth way, because like Paley, those writers tend to focus on the question of whether complex phenomena, like biological phenomena, can be explained in some way other than in terms of a designing intelligence. But again, complexity has nothing to do with what Aquinas is concerned with. Even the simplest kinds of patterns of cause and effect would be enough to get the fifth way going. Okay, so more could be said about that as well as about the other arguments, but that gives you a basic idea of how the fifth way is supposed to go. And here too, as with the other arguments, Aquinas ends the argument by saying, and this we call God, meaning he wants to say that this being whose existence he claims to have proved in the argument is the God of traditional theism. That raises the question, well, why attribute to it all the divine attributes? Why suppose that this supreme intellect he's argued for in the fifth way is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, outside time and space, unique, so that we have monotheism and so forth? But as I've said, Aquinas defends that claim after giving the fifth way in the subsequent sections of the Summa Theologiae. And so I've sketched out in earlier videos in this series some of the sorts of arguments he would give for why we have to attribute omnipotence, omniscience, moral, supreme goodness, perfection, and so forth to to the God he's argued for in the fifth way, and in all the five ways for that matter. Okay, so that wraps up the fifth way, and with it, our look at Aquinas' five ways. In a final video, I'll address questions that viewers will be raising about these arguments, and so we'll see you in that final remaining video.